Good morning, all. See a few people still signing into the webinar this morning. Recovering what's new in NX 11. I'm not going to be covering some of the bigger things that are new. That's not really necessarily part of the core product as far as convergent modeling, the additive manufacturing, and generative modeling. Look forward to future webinars for those specific topics. This is more for those the core NX product modeling, sheet metal, and drafting. Also kind of touching a little bit back on some things that are new in NX 10 that you may not be aware of. Not all clients are moving directly from NX 11 or moving to NX 11 from NX 10. They may be jumping over 10 from 9. So we'll hold questions to the end. I'll open it up for Q&A and see what kind of questions are out there. So starting in NX 10, they started with a new light format. NX 9 is kind of a dark black border and boundary on it, but you can always go into your user interface preferences and change how your NX look is. It says light right there, light recommended, and I tend to just leave it there because it's nice and light and easy to work with. Documentation server, if you are hosting your own docs on your network server, it may be time to look into moving it out to the Siemens documentation server. It's less reliant on making sure that the client is updated on Java and the server is updated on Java. It minimizes how many times help is inaccessible by the users. And having help accessible by the users is quite handy. You open up a new dialog you may not be totally familiar with, you hit the F1 key, it takes you out to help and lets you search the documentation server and learn more about that particular dialog. Resource bar has been enhanced. It knows about second monitors. You can pin it and unpin it. There's a little gear up here in the upper left-hand corner of your resource bar. You can also turn tools on and off much easier from the little gear right there. So if you don't really use the HD3D tools, or you don't necessarily need to have a web browser on there, you can just turn those off. Especially if you're jumping from NX 9 and you haven't seen NX 10 yet, after many years of having a scroll mouse go in a certain direction, it is reversed. The zoom has changed from, if you think model-centric versus camera-centric, NX has always been more model-centric, where I scroll the wheel out and the model just scrolls away from the screen. And if I scroll in, it comes back to me. You can switch this in customer defaults, and this is a user setting that I usually will allow to be open and not locked for a whole site. Before NX 10, there was a environment variable listed here on the screen showing that you could change the mouse scroll direction, but with an environment variable. NX 10 and up, that's no longer available. So you have to go into your customer defaults to switch your zooming direction. Dialogues starting in NX 10 also are much easier to search and customize. So of all the commands that are in NX, sometimes you had to remember in the past what sub-menu drop down that command happened to be in. Now you can just do a search and find the command that you want to add in. Makes it a whole lot nicer and easier, much faster, certainly, to customize a toolbar. If you use the box view section, you can essentially clip to extents and pick an object in an assembly and create a little box around it. And it's great for visualization. It's great for just trying to figure out, what's going on with that particular part, doing clearance analysis and the like. I imagine everyone that's used NX for any length of time, they need to reference something back to the original datum CSIS of the part, and you start scrolling to it, and it stays the same size on the screen. So it feels like you're chasing your tail. You're just chasing it into the screen, and it never changes size. You can now, under visualization preferences, change both how it acts when you're zooming in and out, whether it has a fixed size on the screen, or you can uncheck that, and then as you zoom in it gets larger, you zoom out it gets smaller, and you can have it show through or not show through your model. So that can be awfully handy. There's another comment here about the raster image. couple releases ago, you could start adding a raster image in. It's under the datum pull down, and you could navigate out to the file system, grab an image and pull it in, and then start drawing on top of that image as far as like industrial design information. That raster image can now be stored in Team Center and accessed in Team Center, but it's not an associative connection because the raster image is actually saved inside the CAD model. And if that image does change, it's not going to change the embedded image that's in the model, just to be aware of that. When you first fire up NX 11, there is a product excellence program alert that will pop up, and it will ask you if you want to, it'll tell you where to go to uncheck this product excellence program, whether or not you want to participate, and display initial startup message. I believe it only shows up the first time you start NX 11. After that, it's just in the background. Basically, what Siemens is doing is kind of collecting how the system is being used, what your button clicks are, how you're hunting and looking for tools to try and minimize how much time you're spending off the graphic screen. And if you've noticed over the past few releases, the right-click functionality has been expanded, and it is more useful on the screen. The idea is to minimize your mouse travel and button clicks that are out there. But you can uncheck that if you don't want the system to pull information and send it back to Siemens. For those of you who've gotten a new laptop recently and realized all of a sudden that all your icons have essentially disappeared on your screen because the new 4K displays make your icons really, really tiny, NX 11 now has support for 4K displays by allowing you to go up to 200%. Here's an example over here that shows from extra small up to extra large. So you can change all your toolbar settings to be able to see the icons that are on your screen without having to have like a third-party magnifier on your desktop for Windows. A couple more NX enhancements that are really quite useful. You can now use CTRL+TAB to switch between parts, and you get a nice little preview of those parts. And it also allows for application switching. So if you're drafting in one part and in sheet metal in another part, when you switch between those two parts, it puts you back in the application that was last used in that part file. So that can be awfully handy, especially when you're drafting and you realize you need to adjust the clearance of on a hole. You jump into the part, you realize you're still in drafting, you got to switch your application, go back to drafting, go back to the drafting file rather. They have to switch back to drafting. And it's a time saver. Once you get used to it, you never want to go back. Also, the information windows are becoming more HTML based. So instead of just a raw text file, it is broken up into cells that make it a little bit easier to find and use information out of it. However, if you have any kind of customized scripts that are working with the information window, you may have to look at those and see how it's pulling that information in for you NX Open people out there. Expressions have been enhanced. You no longer need to predefine all of your variables. So if you come up with an equation that you want to have to drive the length of a part or the width of a part, you can build your formula. The formula, if it has undefined variables, will be pink. And then you go through and then define your variables. So it kind of makes it more along the lines of building your math formula and then defining your variables. Before, it would just error and tell you that you can't do this. The variable doesn't exist. You have to go build your variables first and then build your formula on top of it. It's also a little bit smarter in figuring out what you're doing in the expression editor. If you multiply two lengths together, you get an area. If you multiply three lengths together, it automatically switches to volume. If you start typing in a string with quotation marks, it automatically switches over to string. So you don't necessarily have to predefine as many things as you used to have to predefine. Sketch enhancements. 2D synchronous tools were actually added back in NX 9, but as I travel the country and talk to people that work in NX, a lot of people just don't know they're there. So I like to show that off to people. Added into NX is the more simplified or more user-friendly spline creation. You can create G1, G2 condition at the endpoint conditions of your spline. And if you use like offset curve or any kind of other recipe curves in the past, if you went back to do a trimming operation, those recipe curves would then become, would break the associativity. Now it no longer breaks the associativity. Another enhancement in Sketcher is like from within the sketch itself, you can wave link in geometry from your assembly. So just like anything else that has an inferred wave link, you can click on the create interpart link. If you toggle that on in the context of a sketch while you're working in an assembly, you can grab geometry from that assembly and the sketch will reference it. This is one of my biggest, most happy advances in NX 11 that I like, as I've been burned so many times by creating my sketch at the wrong scale, several orders of magnitude off. I start sketching really tiny and I need it to be a really big part. So there's a scale on first driving dimension, which is quite awesome. I love it. The first dimension you place on the sketch, it will scale it appropriately, and I don't have to go through and redraw my sketch if I made a mistake on the starting off on the size. And it shows here where to go in the customer defaults to find that setting. There's some new sketch enhancements as far as constraints. You can use vertical and horizontal alignment, which is different than midpoint. Midpoint creates a constraint that is also perpendicular to the line that you have created, and midpoint allows you to just create a vertical midpoint or a horizontal midpoint constraint between two objects. There's also a new tangent and perpendicular to a string that I'll show off. Sketch dimension type, you can now dimension to the midpoint of an arc or a line. Just to be aware that now that the midpoint is a selectable snap point for dimensions, it is something to be aware of as you're placing your dimensions, because you now have a new point that it will also infer and grab for you. So you have to just know that it can do that, because it will do it for you accidentally on occasion. There's a new sketch type, sketch group type called scalable, and I'll demo that as well. It allows you to scale an entire sketch group. And if you're not familiar with sketch groups, I'll be showing that off as well. There's a sketch browser now that allows you to more easily unwind somebody else's sketch, figure out what's going on if you have an over-constrained or an under-constrained condition that you're trying to suss out. It gives you a graphical browser, shows you the state of the part that you're working with, or the line curves that you're working with, and what those constraints are. So this kind of replaces the add remove constraints dialog, and it's more visual, a little bit easier to use. There's a new sketch enhancement to display reference curves or not display reference curves in your sketch. So minor improvement, but can be useful nonetheless. Another NX enhancement is the rendering engine in NX 11 is now Lightworks iRay Plus. It's a ray traced studio rendering. It uses all your cores. It is pretty fast in rendering, and it produces pretty phenomenal results in the end. But those of you out there that are interested in rendering, look into the iRay Plus ray tracing rendering that's available in NX 11. Fill surface has been enhanced to allow it to fit through curves, and you can also fit a face to a faceted body. There is a new arrow design. If you go to Insert Arrow Design, you'll see 4 tools in there, as well as Blend Pocket for arrow flanges, ribs, steps, and shelves. So we really don't get into the aerospace design in here, but I just wanted to make that known that it's a new set of tools that are specifically for aerospace and vehicular structure design. Edge blend now allows for curvature continuous G2 blending, and face blend has been updated and is a little bit easier to use as far as its picks for putting hold lines in for your tangent control curves. So it's I'm going to show that off as well. Replace face now allows you to use a datum plane to replace a face. Before, you would have to create a surface and then replace that face, or somehow trim it out and do other things with it. Wrap and unwrap curves allows for multiple ruled developable surfaces. That's a tongue twister. And there's a detect primitives, which adds a face analysis to, say, an STL import, so that you can it will aid in reverse engineering. So it'll automatically pick out planes, spheres, cones, cylinders, etc. Law extension has added an angular correction to give a better, smoother output surface. I've yet to run into a surface that has needed an angular correction so far, but the angular correction is there and allows you to correct it within a certain margin. It's set here to 0.5. Trim sheet is more clearly defined and a little bit easier to use. Sometimes the prompts in NX aren't necessarily common English. You have to understand what NX is talking about, and it seems to be a little bit easier to use now. And also, it used to be called trimmed sheet. Now it's called trim sheet. So it's they've updated the name of it as well. This is one a lot of people have been looking forward to, is flattening and forming. And NX 11 is a fully featured part, fully featured feature rather, where I can flatten a part, map geometry to that part, and then map that back to the formed sheet, and then use that for trimming out of my say my fuselage section there. The flattening tool does not use physics at all. It just uses geometry. Uses an area preservation and a line length preservation. There's a few other algorithms that go in there for flattening it out, but it is rather fast and can replace other flattening methods that used in the past. Starting in 11.0.1, a new feature was added in called Combine, and you can use multiple intersecting sheets to create a solid. Or you can use multiple intersecting sheets and pick regions that you want to keep and regions that you want to dispose of. I'll show that off as well. This was actually added in NX 10, the notch versus cliff blend, but I like to show this off as well because it's a little known feature as well, so I'll demo this. But here it shows it off as far as what it's going to try and do for you, whether or not it's a cliff blend or a notch blend, and what those differences are, and I'll show that off live in the demo. There's a whole tool enhancement where you can control not just the cylindrical depth, you can also control the depth to the cone tip. So if that's important to prevent breakout, then you can control the depth to the cone tip, though it doesn't necessarily change how it's going to show up in drafting. So drafting is always going to go to the bottom of the cylindrical face. Part attributes, there's a new editing method for bulk edit where you can pull in everything and makes it look like more like a spreadsheet type of approach, and is more user-friendly for editing multiple attributes at the same time. Starting in NX 11, we've picked up support for Step 242. Step 242 is the standard that will pull in model-based definition, or in NX terminology, PMI, product manufacturing information. And it looks to be the step format of the future. Not all CAD systems right now can read in and write out Step 242, but it is coming, and NX 11 fully supports the standard. Assembly enhancements, you now have the ability for your distance and angle constraints to have limits, so you can limit the distance or angle of a part based on the constraints you're placing on it, and I'll show that off as well. Also in the assembly enhancement is the column selector. It used to be that if you wanted to put in a non-standard column, you had to know what that attribute was called and then type that attribute in. Now it has a column, an attribute column selector. So if in the context of your assembly, if you have parts that have attributes in them, you can then select those attributes directly and add them into your assembly navigator column structure. If you're not familiar with all the changes that are happening in NX drafting, the right-click functionality and the on-screen displays are much enhanced. You don't have to go into settings as deeply as you used to make changes. You can quickly and easily create single-sided jog dimensions, add foreshortening symbols, create automatic line breaks, and there's a new workflow starting in NX 10 for creating a section line first that can be a sketch, and then afterwards you can then pull individual section views from those. And lastly, in the documentation, there's a discussion about the Cadence part solutions, which is supposed to be added into your resource bar, the reuse library. This is not currently available and is going to be available in a future release. It was inadvertently added into the documentation, and it's still in my presentation. So let's get onto some live demo here. So first off, if I just go in and say extrude and I hit my F1 key, right here I go to my Siemens documentation server. I'm actually going up to that for my my help because it's easier. It's less maintenance for the CAD admin to have to take care of it. So I really kind of like that. The resource bar enhancements. If you just click on the gear over here, you can pin it open or not have it pinned open, and you can also right click on the gear and uncheck the tools that you don't necessarily use. I don't necessarily need manufacturing wizards on there, and maybe I don't want the web browser, but they're all just here for me to pick and turn back on if I need them. Mouse scrolling zoom under gateway view operations, forward or backward to zoom in based on your preference. If you come from SOLIDWORKS, they tend to like it a little bit different than what NX has always been in the past, but you'll notice that you'll be scrolling in the opposite direction of what you thought you'd be scrolling in if you don't update that in your session. So if I go into my view section tool and clip the work section, I'm going to here to edit it. Actually, I'm going to select an object, and I have box turned on for my type. So I'm going to put in that I want a 0.5 margin to my box, and I see that I quickly and easily have isolated the part that I want to work on down here. Maybe it's a screw. I want to check the interference for it, and then I can unclip the work section, and my box disappears. So that's an enhancement. It's pretty useful. This is another one that's I find quite useful, is the control tab switching between parts. Preferences visualization here, and I can check on or uncheck fixed size on screen. Uncheck that, and then I can my datum CSIS actually gets bigger as I zoom into it and zoom out from it. And you can also tell it to not show through the model or show through the model. So that's another preference that can be adjusted. And under your customize, if you go down here to icons and tooltips, you've got your extra large 200% that can help get your toolbars back up to a usable size when you end up with a 4K display. I've seen more and more 4K displays shown out there as I visit other companies. Here I have a part that this is a fully constrained sketch, and if you look at I'm in a sketch and task environment here. If I look at my pull down in this zone, in this gallery over here, I have a few tools that have a little red squiggle through them, and it are the 2D synchronous tools. So if you look in here, there's actually a delete curve. So why would I need a delete curve if I could just select this curve here and delete it and it goes away? Control Z and you can bring that back. If I use my delete curve, you'll see that it is going to heal that, and there's actually a setting for that. So you can heal that curve, and it becomes it heals it for you. And also the 2D synchronous tools allow you to do other changes as well. If, for instance, you needed to make this part wider, I could just double click on this top value, go to the end, say I want to make this plus 50, and I end up with an overconstrained condition. I could troubleshoot and try and figure out what's going on with it, but I could then again use my move curve command, pick up those curves. I also want it to be symmetric, so it picks up the other one there. I'm going to flip my vector, and since I'm doing it symmetric, I want to make that bump out 25 millimeters for my 50 millimeter change, and it automatically went through and updated the sketch constraints that it needed to update to perform the function that I wanted it to perform. Studio Spline, just real quickly, as I place my first point, I get a G1, G2 connection that I can put on and start building the spline up. I'll make a G1 tangency constraint there and say OK. I end up with an overconstraint condition because it inferred something that I didn't see there as I was building this, so get rid of that. So I start with a sketch, build a new sketch, I'm going to put it on a plane. You may notice that the sketch creation dialog is much simplified. It doesn't have as many inputs on it. I can also create a new plane here, and it starts to open it up to more information that you may want. And let's get rid of that sketch that's already there. So I just let it be inferred. I'm going to use the work part origin, and don't notice what scale I'm working at because I'm moving too fast for that. Place a couple of constraints on here. Then I need to place a dimension on it, and I realize it's not supposed to be 0.32, it's supposed to be 32 millimeters. So as I kick in 32 millimeters, it automatically scaled everything up for me, and now I can go through and finish the dimensioning out my sketch because it's scaled on first dimension. So that could be quite handy. Oh. There we go. So here I have two line segments that I've built that I built a perpendicular to a string constraint and a tangent to a string constraint. Truthfully, I don't have a use case for this as far as like a production part, but this does allow me to take my constrained geometry and drag it around on the string that I have here. This particular one is using an intersection curve that's intersecting the entire part, so I can drag it around. And again, with a perpendicular to a curve, I can drag this around as well. If I were to create a new piece of geometry out here and just hide these two, oops. And if I put a midpoint constraint on it, this is a perpendicular constraint. May not be exactly what I want, but if I put a constraint in here and do a vertical constraint, then it's vertically aligned. So vertical alignment constraint. Same thing with a horizontal alignment out here. That is a point-to-point alignment. Again, like I mentioned, there's the ability to dimension from a midpoint. So be aware of that because it can snap to the midpoint depending on how you're picking your geometry. I find that I don't necessarily need to dimension to midpoints very often, so that's ends up somewhat being in the way as I'm building parts. I'll make the sketch external, and if I enter the sketch, I see that I don't have any kind of sketch groups in here, but I can create a new sketch group under Menu, Format, Group, New Sketch Group, and that sketch group can become active as soon as I create it. If you're not familiar with sketch groups, there's a few different types that you can create. A rigid sketch group is essentially having the ability to have multiple sketches within one sketch itself, so that they automatically update as they interrelate with one another. So I can turn this into a scalable sketch group and say, okay, to make it scalable and make it make sense to me, I'm going to make this 100 millimeter long line. And since this was my sketch group was active when I created that, let's go ahead. I'm going to get rid of that dimension right there. I'm going to uncheck active on here, and I have no dimensions on my sketch. Say I want to make this sketch group scaled up 10%, so just make that 110. Maybe I want to make it 125. My sketch group scales automatically. Close that, and you say, well, what if I want to get all my sketch dimensions back? So I can make this active, go ahead and get rid of this. Oops. Actually, not make that active. Go ahead and select that scalable sketch group constraint and then delete that. I get all my sketches back, or my sketch constraints back that are already adjusted to the 25% increase that I gave it. Say finish. And it scaled it up that 25% for me. So that's a scalable sketch group. Another sketch enhancement is the Sketch Relations browser. I just right-click on an object, go into Sketch Relations browser, and I see what all is constraining this particular piece of geometry, and I can open them up and highlight the curves themselves so I can explicitly identify exactly what I want to find. Here I have reference geometry that is not shown when I'm outside of the sketch. That is a sketch preference. If I go to Task, Sketch Settings, I can display reference curves outside the sketch. When I finish this, then those reference curves stay displayed. It's a user preference. If you have a lot of construction geometry, you may want to have that hidden so it only shows what you really want to show. Fill surface has been around for a little while, but they've added the ability to fill through a hold line, basically. So I'm going to switch this to a G1 condition, have it patch into the part. If I select all that, you kind of see that there's a little bit of a depression in this this patch here. So I can get rid of that. I'm going to go to curve, create a bridge curve across here just real quick. And when I use my fill surface, I'm going to have it fit to curves. I'm going to select those curves first and then have it fit to that curve there. And it forces it to go through that curve, and it gives me a much better surface as I'm patching that together. If you look under Menu, Insert, all the way down here you'll see Arrow Design, where you see the arrow, flange, rib, step, and whatnot. Just to point that out, that's a new set of tools for the aerospace people out there. As well as the Control tab to get between parts. When you go to the window and pull down, you get little previews that come up with the part itself, which is quite handy. Like I mentioned under on the presentation, there's edge blend, but I can also use a regular tangent edge blend and a G2 curvature edge blend, which gives you a row control. So if I bump this out to say 500, you see the preview here. If I bump this down to say 0.1, it's a pretty flat transition. 0.9 makes it a very sharp transition, and 0.5 is your basic rolling ball blend as you roll around the part. The face blend, go ahead and reset my dialog here because I'm not sure how it was left last. Face 1, face 2, I'm going to flip both of those over so they come to the inside. And again, this is a large part. Your width limits have been updated to allow me to pick your tangent selection curves. And I picked them, and I ended up with a radius that's too small for these faces because I'm forcing it to be a circular edge blend. So I want this just to be tangent. It would be symmetric if everything was symmetrically offset, but I want it to be tangent asymmetric, and then I see a preview of how it's going to hold those lines. And very quickly I can create I have an edge blend or a face blend with hold lines. If I wanted to edit this, show the parents here, go into the sketch, adjust how that looks, and I have my face blend is updated, of course. There's an enhancement to the edge blend tool itself. Under settings, there's a segment blend to match face segments. What that means here is that this edge blend along this front section here doesn't match the face segments that it's created from. So if I edit this and turn that on, then my face segments then match all the way through. Aesthetics and possibly analysis is something that a couple reasons why you may want to have that segmented out. And also, I'm going to go ahead and show this datum plane here. You use replace face, pick all these faces here, and then the replacement face could be that datum plane there. And it says the motion face has been consumed. So very quickly I can alter this part to a datum plane. I like to use my command finder whenever I don't necessarily know exactly where a tool is, because it's very quick and easy to type it in and have it found. Do a face analysis essentially, and it will come back with detect primitives and show me what, in a visual setting, what these types of features are on this this little golf club head. And here you can see that I've got a couple of cylinders, a couple of planes. There's even some spherical faces that are in here. So it can help with reverse engineering. I just go to regular view versus a face analysis view. I can switch back and forth to see that, and it's saved inside my model. On the Surface tab, I use my law extension, and I pick that for my curve and my face. I want to flip that over so we can see the top of it. There's this angular correction that's in here. If I check it on, I can have the angular correction correct within a certain parameter. So if I want this to be a 1 degree angular correction, oh, I end up with a self-intersecting. Oh, I probably should not have that flat to the surface. There we go. And create it out that way. Like I said, I haven't had necessarily a need for angular correction, but it's there to help fix a surface that may be a little bit warbly. Trim sheet is enhanced. It's a little bit easier to use. Select the sheet. Select the object. You have a keep and discard region, and if I were to flip that from keep to discard, then I get the opposite. It's a little bit easier to use, a little bit less like what is it asking for. Flattening and forming. If I go to my surface tab, flattening and forming down here under more, I want to flatten this. I pick the face. I'm going to give it an origin and then a primary pull direction, and then it gives me a quick flattened surface. But if I wanted to have some witness lines or other things that I want to map down there, I go to my curve tool. I'm going to do an offset curve and face. Took the face edges and offset them in 25 millimeters. I'm also going to use a new tool called isocolline curve, where I can pick the face and a vector. I'm going to pick the Z vector here, and it gives me the intersection curve, basically the silhouette curve, if I flatten this out, of that face there in that particular pull direction. And if I use my flattening and forming tool, oops, set it to flattening, specify the origin, the pull direction, I'll get a preview. Then I can select the transformation objects as well and get those curves to map down. Say okay, and those map down. I can use those for stretch analysis and the like. I can also go in here and edit with rollback and take a look at the distortion maps. So you have a length distortion map that shows you your minimum maximum length distortion, and you have area as well as an angle. And those are basically the three algorithms that it's using to flatten this out. And then quickly add a sketch. So put a little porthole circle there. Pattern that geometry along that center axis curve, and go back to surface. Flattening and forming. I want to do forming and reuse. It says select existing flattening feature, and then select the transformation objects. And these will be transformed back up to the formed sheet, and then I can use, say, a trim curve to or trim sheet to then trim out those porthole faces. Another tool that's very handy is a combine tool. This one is a couple different approaches here. I know what I have here, and I can just do a rectangular select and pick everything up. Let's do that again. Pick all these up, and I see a preview of what I'm creating. If I wanted to then say I don't really want that one with a hole through it, just say OK, and I get a solid out of it pretty quickly. You can also go through and individually pick them. Select the bodies, and it will start giving previews based on what it sees. Depending on how you have it set up, it might be a little bit more difficult to figure out what it's trying to do, because it's also selecting regions for you. And what that's doing is, if I use the combine tool on this one, I select these bodies, and it automatically infers the regions that I want to keep, but I could then force the regions that I want to keep if I want to just keep this center section here, or I can keep the two outers like that. I have my two sheet bodies selected. Powerful tool. Just got released in NX 11.0.1, so it wasn't available in 11.0. Just real quickly on delete face, I can delete a blend. I could delete it as a notch or a cliff, and you get the little preview that shows up what that means. But this is if I select that as a cliff blend versus a notch blend, you'll see how it adjusts those faces. And what that basically means is this blend is partial. There's a tangency that's missing. So as a cliff blend, it's just going to stop wherever that face is and cut it off there. As a notch blend, it's going to calculate out where that tangency would be if the tangency existed and push that face back to where that tangency would be. So those are the big differences there. And before we run out of time here, I have a pin in a slot. If I select my pin and look at my assembly navigator, I've got a distance constraint that's built into here. If I look at that distance constraint, I need to load up the parts. I see that I have an upper and a lower limit, and also this empty checkbox here. If this box is checked and it's fixed to the value that it's currently set at, you can still have upper and lower limits as well. But this allows, having this box unchecked allows me to then move this in that slot, and it stops at either end. If you were to take a look at this distance constraint, you'd see that this is actually a measurement, and it's measuring the length of this slot. So if I go into this part and adjust the length of this to say 400, my measurement will update the new length of the slot, and it will then create those limits for me in that new slot. It also works on angle as well. I select this plate here. I have an angle constraint. Again, just the way I picked the geometry, I ended up with a 180-90 instead of a 0-90. So just how it's picked, and it's limited to 90 degrees of rotation, as I would want to have in my little flap valve here. And we are down to the last few minutes of this webinar and what's new in NX 11. If there are any questions, you can type them into the questions window, and I'd be happy to answer them. I'm also available at m.martin@appliedcix.com for any questions that are on this particular webinar. Let's just check this and make sure I got what I wanted to show here. I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm going to continue on with a couple other things. There's a long-awaited feature called swept volume, where I created a pin in here, and I wanted to have that pin sweep through on a guide curve. Swept volume has been like I said, it's been a long-awaited feature in NX. This pin, I sketched and extruded it in this part file, but I could also have just linked it in and then swept that around. So it depends on how your workflow is. Before, I would have had to section this and then create a sketch out of it and then sweep that along a guide curve as well. But it's swept volume is now available for you, and there's also update to end. Let's see if we can show this off here. My first example here is just planar. It's just a pin and a plate. Pretty simple. Let's take a longer to update than I thought. I also have created a cone with, again, a swept volume that starts with a pin down here at the bottom and then sweeps up a helix and goes out the top of the part. So I could use that as a driving sketch for some sort of a pin adjustment. Swept volume is great for that. There is a tool called variable offset face, which can be quite powerful. It's one of those tools that kind of change how you, shouldn't talk and type at the same time, change how you go about creating geometry. So I want to show a couple more surfaces in here. And bring on variable offset face, and I pick the face, and I pick these as boundaries. And it starts breaking up, these little arrowheads all over here start breaking up the face into different zones. And if I highlight the zone here, I can see what it's supposed to be. So maybe I want this to be -10. In this zone here, I want this to be a bridge and be tangent. So you can see how it's going to offset there already. The sister offset over here, I'm going to leave that at 0. And this one, maybe make this one 8. And this last one, -8. And very quickly I'm able to create a variable offset surface. I'll go ahead and hide those other surfaces there. Very complex surface, but again, it's one of those things you have to know that the tool exists, so that then you can use it to modify a simpler sheet to a more complex sheet. Okay. And lastly, this is one of those that I just switched into drafting, and it went automatically from modeling to drafting for me, which is quite nice. Again, if you haven't seen all the different options that are available on the dimensions now, every one of these nodes has the ability to have a different input. You can adjust your offsets, your gaps, your line breaks as well. The line breaks are automatic. You don't have to worry about using a symbol anymore. And I believe that's just about it. Like I said, if there are any questions, feel free to get a hold of me at mmartin@appliedcix.com. We're also available at info@appliedcix.com. And since there are no questions that are coming up, let's see, can I all right. We'll be posting this webinar as well up on YouTube, and a link to the presentation will be available here shortly. I just got to get over to my web guy and he'll update everything. So without any further ado, I'll let you guys get back to your day, and thanks for attending What's New in NX 11.